This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
My name is Barry Colfer and I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin. A very warm welcome to this morning's webinar on strategic foresight systems, what policymakers can learn from Finland. This is the second webinar in a series we've organised in conjunction with the UCD Centre for Innovation, Technology and Organisation. We're really pleased to have this engagement. In this latest webinar, an expert panel of leaders and thinkers will take an analytical approach to the world-famous Finnish ecosystem. They'll give a critical assessment of the Finnish model and will try to compare with other international approaches, including here in Ireland. I'm really delighted that this event will be chaired by Professor Eva Leinonen, who's been president of Maynooth University since 2021, after 5 years in leadership roles at Murdoch University in Perth, Australia. Professor Leinonen was born and raised in Finland. She and her two brothers were the first in their family to attend university, and her own experience has cemented her belief in the role of education as a social equaliser, with the power to transform for the better the lives of individuals, families and whole communities. A linguist by training, Professor Leinonen has extensive international experience in education settings in the UK, across Europe, Australia and elsewhere. Professor Leinonen, again, a very sincere thanks and a hand over to you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. And thank you, Barry, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you heard, I am from Finland, but I have now been in Ireland for about coming up to 5 years soon. And as Barry said, this webinar is a part of a series of webinars and on the Finnish Futures ecosystem and organised in collaboration with the UCD Centre for Innovation, Technology and Organisation. And I would also like, on behalf of the organisers, thank the Finnish Embassy because they have been involved in enabling this series. There had, I think, Barry, been 2 other webinar series in the Finnish Future ecosystem. The first one, I think it was in September, when we had the Finnish Minister for European Affairs leading that session. And then there was another one. It was about the Finnish ecosystem in the European context. And I think the second one was in October, which looked at more the sort of structural and descriptive parts, organizations, parliamentary processes and roles and so on of the Finnish ecosystem. So today's session, as Barry said, will focus more on a bit of a critical analysis of the system, but also reflecting particularly on Ireland's approach to foresight and long-term thinking and institutional imagination, and including how existing Irish structures might evolve in that context. So we're delighted today to have a fantastic panel of speakers. Thank you very much for giving your time so generously today. And, I will ask each panel member to speak for about 5 minutes, opening remarks, and then we'll go to discussion and Q&A. But let me first of all introduce our panel members today. So we have first speaker will be Elizabeth Canavan, and Elizabeth is Assistant Secretary General in the Department of the Taoiseach, leading social policy and public service reform. She also serves as secretary to several cabinet subcommittees, and she has overseen major crisis responses, including the government's responses to COVID-19 and the Ukraine humanitarian crisis. So welcome, Elizabeth. Our second speaker is Marc Ó Cathasaigh, who was a Green Party TD for Waterford for 2020 to 2024, and was part of the team that negotiated the 2020 programme for government. He also represented the directors twice in the UN high-level political forum on the SDGs. And in 2023, he introduced a Commission for Future Generations bill, which is now awaiting the 3rd stage in the door. So welcome, Marc. Then Niamh Garvey joined the National Economic and Social Council in March 2021 and works in the area of sustainable development and climate action. Niamh was previously the head of policy and advocacy at Troika and also held previous roles in research and advocacy, for instance, at Christian Aid and the Institute of Development Studies. So welcome, Niamh. And then finally, Kevin. Kevin joined the department, Kevin Daly joined the Department of Finance in 2023 to set up the Strategic Economic Development Unit, which is undertaking the work for Future 40. Very much looking forward to hearing about that, and a long-term economic and fiscal analysis of Ireland. He worked in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment from 2017, where his role involved being responsible for the expert group on future skills needs secretariat, as well as other areas. So that is our esteemed panel today. So welcome, Elizabeth, Marc, Niamh, and Kevin. We very much look forward to your opening remarks. But before that, I just want to say that please, those of you in the audience, please use the Q&A on Zoom, and feel free to send your questions as the speakers are speaking. And I'll come to them after the opening remarks and a little bit of discussion. I also wanted to remind everybody that today's presentation and the Q&A are both on the record. So let me now then hand over to Elizabeth for her opening remarks. Over to you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for the invitation. So I should say I'm not an expert on futures and foresight, but obviously it's something we've been thinking a lot about, and very happy to be engaged in this series of lectures, which has helped our understanding, I suppose, of what we want or should be thinking about doing in the Irish context. So I suppose in general terms, the concept of foresight is something that we absolutely agree is a really good idea. But we're very mindful that in the way it is constructed and construed around the world, that there is still a struggle to have a consistent understanding about what's important in foresight. I suppose the second thing, looking at the Finnish model, is that, you know, that structured and cross-sectoral approach is really attractive, and it definitely adds value. And while we can think about how those central processes work, it's the wider ecosystem and how we generate traction, momentum, practices, and the networks at multiple levels are going to be what make foresight matter. And I think there are different ways of conceiving and framing foresight, and maybe we're better than we think. So I've been sort of thinking about it in terms of Ireland and how we might think about and are thinking about our doing foresight. So, you know, there's a sort of a view that Ireland's capacity for long-term thinking is weak. And I think there's a bit of a perception versus reality here. I think we actually have some good examples of our capacity to do this. Institutionally, obviously, we have our National Economic and Social Council that has a very specific remit to give government advice, which is forward-looking and looks at challenging medium to long-term issues. We also have other actors, such as the ESRI. We have obviously the work Kevin I will talk about later on Futures 40. In health, we've had some really good analysis around Sláinte care. And I suppose, you know, one of my colleagues is looking back at, believe it or not, an essay that was written by Charles Haughey some time ago, for those of you who remember, former Prime Minister, Taoiseach, is the establishment. He's in his essay, he talked about, it was a very future-oriented essay, and talked about the establishment of the IFSC, about tax incentives for commercial film industry, about the establishment of the NTMA, and about the development of temporal bars. So that was really born out of a futures orientation. So I think we do have a capacity to do it, and we have done it in the past. And I guess we do have some of the structural things that will help us. But the challenge is ensuring that we get consistent traction on what futures thinking is telling us. So I suppose what I'd say is we've had some successes, but it is mixed. I think, you know, the challenge, and this is a challenge all over the world, is about the nature of the political cycle. So I think we've kind of got context problems that make foresight harder to land, I suppose. So we've a fairly short political cycle, and there is a tendency inevitably to focus on incrementalism rather than radical rethinks. I think we've had some really good strategies that actually are quite forward and future oriented and are planned on the basis of future trajectories. But sometimes the results are take too long to realize. So there's a sense that some of those bigger strategies kind of fade out. Now, it's not to say that they aren't implemented over time, but they don't necessarily get regarded as having had that really strong futures orientation to start with. I think the budget process we have arguably drives the wrong incentives and thinking modes, because there tends to be a focus on the additionality. So we start with the existing level of service, and that's a sort of a baseline, and then we take it on from there. And that's not a very good thinking mode for departments and for sectors if you're only thinking about the incremental additional piece. So I think we have got this demand for radicalism and a lot of talk about radicalism, but it's kind of combined with a nervousness about the disruption of existing models. And that's both for government and non-government actors. So sometimes we look at models we have of doing things, and people want more of the same, or we're investing in more of the same, and actually we need to change the modality entirely. And we're a little bit stuck because, there's a lot of tension around changing the way we do things up to now. So I think the question for us is how we can be bold enough in our thinking, rather relying even in thinking about the future and what we already know and understand. So instead of doing more and more of the same, that we have some way of breaking out of that. So for me, the real challenge then is also generating a demand for an engagement with futures thinking. So really having a much more future-oriented public discourse. So obviously government have a really strong role to play in this, but there is also a role for everybody in the Dáil in our parliament. There's a role, I think, for the media in what and who they choose to platform and how they platform issues. I think the civil service obviously has a role in long-term thinking and linking it to agenda setting, linking it to governance, and having really deliberative processes about how we harness other actors and collaborate with them on futures thinking, because we do have people doing futures thinking. And I think all of these can contribute to generating a public appetite for deeper debates about the future. And if we generate that appetite, I think the question we have then is, how do we integrate the citizen input, voice, and insights? So I think that aligns with some thinking around kind of participatory knowledge society, and the idea of needing to align our interests if we're going to get deep into a kind of a foresight and a futures orientation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's a really good opening remarks from you. And I was just thinking of some of your words there, how to be bold about our thinking and don't keep thinking the same, which is one of those real topics that we all grapple with, and also the kind of demand and engagement and public discourse around it, that as well, which is really important. There's many other thoughts that came to my mind, but I will now hand over to Marc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I suppose I'll begin with a description of how I came to futures thinking and how I arrived at, I suppose, presenting the bill that I did in 2023, which is around the Future Generations Commissioner. My route into it would have been very much around, first of all, things like wellbeing economics. So Kate Rayworth's work. I would have looked at things like post-growth, which Tim Jackson has been talking about. I suppose I would have been looking at how do we move our economic model, or our understanding of our economic model, away from something that is based primarily on the growth imperative. And so I would have been approaching it, unsurprisingly, from a green perspective and a green politics thinking. Those discussions and that reading would have led me into discussion, first of all, with Jane Davidson, who was the originator of the Welsh Future Generations legislation. And then I would have met up with Sophie Howe, who became the first Commissioner of Future Generations over in Wales. So I suppose that my experience probably proceeds from a better understanding of the Welsh model than from the Finnish model, even though I've had a look at both of the systems, and I find much to recommend in both of them. I would say, and I'm maybe slightly at odds with Elizabeth on this, I don't think politics does futures well. I don't think politics does future generations well. Now, Elizabeth did reference this. We have a short electoral cycle. We have an even shorter budgetary cycle. And politics and politicians generally aren't rewarded for taking a long-term view. If I gave if I gave an example, I think the Commission of Taxation and Welfare did an absolutely outstanding piece of work in terms of recommending what we should be doing around our tax base and all sorts. Excellent piece of work, was almost instantly discarded. And certainly from budgetary cycle to budgetary cycle, I don't see people talking, be it on government benches or opposition benches, for the need to integrate some of those more challenging ideas. And if you base your electoral strategy around campaigning for people who don't have a vote, they might not even exist yet, never mind vote, that's quite clearly a flawed electoral strategy. Your electoral strategy needs to aim at people who do vote. And so advocating for future generations or advocating for young people doesn't necessarily translate into political success. The only time that I felt a difference in that was during the 2020 election, and when the Friday for Futures movement was really at its height. And then I did knock on doors, and I did have people asking me about what we're going to do about future generations. I haven't felt that really before or since. And I don't think our political system as a political system does futures well either. I do think that there's great work going on in the Department of Taoiseach. I know I would have sat down with Simon Harris when he was Taoiseach to discuss my piece of legislation. And I know that there's great work happening there. I know that there's great work happening in the Department of Finance. I know NESC are doing absolutely outstanding work. I would say things like the Climate Change Advisory Council is futures focused, or Just Transition Commission, that's also future focused, but it feels very siloed and it feels very difficult to read as a politician, as a legislator, as somebody who on a day-to-day basis is probably more overwhelmed with constituency queries than kind of long-term thinking. So I think one of the really seductive and one of the most easily legible pieces within that Finnish system is the Oireachtas committee, or not the Oireachtas, the parliamentary committee. And the fact that that parliamentary committee is, that the Prime Minister has to answer to that. And I think that has the effect of drawing things together. Now, I know that that's only that top level most visible. And I know that there's all sorts of interesting things that happen at a regional and a local level as well. But I think having that central visibility piece goes to what Elizabeth was talking about generating a demand, generating a narrative, generating something that's easily reported on, easily understood, easily communicated. I think the Welsh model of the Future Generations Commissioner does something similar. It draws that together in a comprehensible way and it puts it in front of people. I think they also did an outstanding job with that Wales We Want series, which was that public consultation piece that Elizabeth talked about. It's so important. And it puts it in front of politicians. Politicians are incredibly busy people. That might not be popular to say, but they are incredibly busy people. And it's very easy, and I'm speaking from long experience here, it's very easy to confuse the urgent with the important. If somebody's been on the phone to you 4 times over a passport application, that's urgent. And your temptation as an office is to put your time into that. That's not necessarily what's important. And it's not necessarily what we want our national legislators to be concentrating on. I would say just briefly, that's why I introduced the legislation. I'm upfront about what the legislation is. I'm not actually legislating for the Commission, because that would be far too big to do as a piece of private members' business. But what I thought was important, that it sparked a conversation. And what I'd really like is I'd like it to instigate a research piece where people like Elizabeth, people like Kieran, people like Niamh, and other actors who are doing excellent work in futures have a look at what we can glean from the Finnish example, what we can glean from the Welsh example, the Icelandic example. Scotland are doing some good work, and see how we can usefully apply that to the Irish context, because I'm in little doubt that futures focused planning is more important than ever. We can see an assault on futures focused planning all across the globe, certainly across the Atlantic, we can see it. And I do think it's something that we need to forefront in our politics. And I think we have examples of useful approaches in Finland, as I said. And I'll conclude on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. Again, a very insightful contribution there. I was just thinking about the kind of how local politics is in Ireland and how that does impact on what is important, what is urgent, how things are communicated, and also what sort of a view one can take, shorter term or longer term. It's all very connected, isn't it? And your point about the research piece is important, Mark. I think we do need to have a really good understanding, not only what is done in other countries, but I think there's a lot of good research done in Ireland at this point in time. And perhaps bringing some of that together would be a really good step forward. I'm even obviously thinking about universities at the moment. I live in the university world and have done all my career. And what incredible work we do for policy, for data, for modeling, and all of that. So maybe there's a piece of work there to be done, and that would be helpful too. So I will now hand over to Niamh, and I think, Niamh, you're going to have some slides as well. Thank you, Niamh.
If your honours there, I could pull the slides up, that'd be great. Thank you. While they're coming up, just to say good morning to everyone and to thank the IIEA for the chance to participate. I think these 3 sessions have been really instructive and informative. I think, as we've heard, many states, all states really face challenges in terms of thinking of long-term thinking. There are lots of pressures. We've heard some of them there, and that are sort of drivers of short-termism in policy making. But with, I suppose, increasing levels of uncertainty and complexity in policy making and global trends, there's a long-term perspective is more important than ever. Last year, NESC identified 10 factors supporting future-focused governance, and I'm going to frame some of my comments around these and highlighting, I guess, some of the contributions that NESC has made in this area. If we maybe could move on to the next slide, please. So the first set of these factors really relate to the institutional architecture. This can include constitutional mechanisms to protect future interests. A 2021 review had highlighted that 41% of UN member states explicitly referenced future generations in their constitutions. And in some cases, this is strengthened in law. For example, in 2020, Norway, a ruling of their courts there found that a constitutional commitment to ensure environmental rights conferred rights on individuals that could be asserted in court, as an example. Broader sets of institutions include the role of independent future institutions such as commissioners, councils, advisory bodies, and so on. I think this the whole range of institutions has been really well covered in this IIEA series, with Finland, being, I suppose, an exemplary case of that extensive ecosystem across public research and private institutions focusing on futures thinking. I guess in Ireland then, the Irish Constitution has no explicit reference to the rights of future generations. And I suppose we don't have quite an extensive a set of futures-focused institutions. And I think we heard there, some areas people have called for, whether it's a Futures Generations Commissioner, a Oireachtas Committee on the Future, and so on. So there are those calls for expanding our ecosystem. However, we do have a number of institutions to build on. And again, a couple of these have also already been referenced. Our own organisation, NESC, our mission is to provide cohesive, forward-looking policy advice on medium to long-term issues. The expert group on future skills needs, has a very much a future focus on skills and the labour market issues. The Climate Change Advisory Council has already been mentioned, of course, and the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, I suppose, to name a number of institutions with that explicitly futures focus. If we move to the next slide, I suppose the second set of factors relate, I guess, to the nature of governance for futures-oriented policy making. And this includes the importance of commitment, vision, and leadership, I suppose, to bring together that sort of focus around preparing for the future. A second key factor here is, I suppose, given high levels of uncertainty and complexity that the futures thinking involves, the need for sort of agile, anticipatory, and experimental governance comes out a lot in the literature and in different countries. I was struck very much in the second of this IIEA series on the reflection of one of the participants on the value of strategic foresight being very much about providing value once it is linked into anticipatory governance. And the third set here is the importance of inclusive processes, which Liz has also referred to, based on social dialogue and engagement. And again, back in the first of this series of talks, Minister Strand really emphasised that Finland's resilience is based very much on shared organisation across government, business and community. And Citra, in the second IIEA lecture in this area, pointed to Finland's future readiness being based on a number of social innovations that had taken place to include more people within decision-making in society. I think in Ireland then, NESC has very much highlighted the importance of vision, guiding in some of our reports the digital, the climate and energy transitions. And we've also underlined the need for cathedral thinking with reference to ensuring that the economy can thrive into the future. And the report numbers are listed there on the slide if people are interested in following up. Across a number of other reports, NESC has also made recommendations to government on the need for, I guess, more proactive anticipatory governance mechanisms. And I guess as far back as the 2009 NESC Futures report, that process recommended a profound change to organisational systems supporting innovation, learning and accountability. I think in the area of inclusive social dialogue and engagement, Ireland has been a world leader in innovations around the use of citizens' assemblies for shaping policy making, and a new civil service policy handbook really very much recognises legitimacy as a core part of policy making based on stakeholder engagement. And I think there's a lot of work in this area on supporting best practice guidance. So I think, as Liz mentioned, there are some areas where we have real strengths in thinking about important areas of future focus. And then the final slide there, the third set of factors, thank you, relate to the practice really around integrating futures into policy making. So critical areas here being knowledge, skills and capacity for civil servants, for policymakers, but I guess all of the actors in the futures ecosystem, particularly in the areas of strategic foresight approaches and strategic planning. And I think Finland again here clearly demonstrates very much the long-term commitment to this, with capacity, knowledge, skills being built up over many years. In Ireland, strategic foresight capacity has been identified as a priority for civil service renewal, but there are a number of recent strategic foresight exercises. I know we're going to hear from Kevin shortly around Future 40, and there's also current collaboration between a number of departments on futures, thinking for innovation and the economy as well. I mean, an important factor in translating futures perspective into practice is, I suppose, in that area of the practical day-to-day decision making, as opposed to, I suppose, analysis that might sit in a report. It's what happens to those insights to bring them into practice. And important here are areas around how we assess performance and our tools for valuing the future. An example, I suppose, we've seen globally is a shift from assessing performance based on more narrowly economic measures to the wider wellbeing approaches. New Zealand is a real leader in this area, and Ireland's own wellbeing framework was launched in 2021. And while it doesn't include the 4 futures-focused capitals that form the basis of the original OECD framework, it does identify 14 out of 35 of the indicators as having importance for future sustainability, and these are all reported on annually. Research suggests that future generations can be, I suppose, discriminated against when the calculations that we use in discounting and the tools that we use for, I suppose, assigning future value to something when we're making decisions can give less weight to the worth of future generations. And back in 2018, NESC recommended reducing the discount rate to reflect, I suppose, a more equal balance when considering futures in policy making. And a final point, I guess, is around expanding the types of data that inform our decision making. So natural capital is a particular challenge when we think of valuing the future, because I guess it's presently undervalued or invisible in current accounting. And NESC has very much called for the acceleration of developing ecosystems accounting, which is commitment and is already underway through the CSO, as well as how, I guess, the insights from such accounting can really be integrated into decision making. So just really to conclude, there's a huge amount Ireland can learn from Finland and indeed other countries. She struck by the Demos point in the second seminar that there's no blueprint. So even as Ireland does learn from others' experience, it'll also be about forging our path and really building on lots of the examples that we already have of sort of homegrown capacity and skills in this area. And in NESC, we're just very much looking forward to continuing to make a contribution as part of the Futures ecosystem in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. A lot of resonance there actually already with the previous speakers. And, there's a lot of good practice, and there's a lot of research that is future focused in Ireland. And, the thoughts that come to my mind just listening to the first three speakers is that there is a sort of piece of work to be done, how we bring some of that together and how we translate that into practice. And, one of the innovations, as you say, Niamh, in Ireland are the citizen assemblies. It's a great social innovation, and it's a great resource and stakeholder engagement process that enables policy to be informed by the citizens. And, the utilization of that in Ireland is very impressive. So I just wanted to, many things that there resonated with my thinking. But I now will hand over to Kevin. You're welcome, Kevin.
Good morning. Yep, I'm Kevin Daly from the Department of Finance. I started a couple of years ago, brought in to set up the Strategic Economic Development Unit. And our main task for the last couple of years has been to develop Future 40, which is a fiscal and economic analysis looking at the next 40 years. It was an enormous piece of work, and I won't go through it now. The main publication is 250 pages. We have created a nice website, which hopefully we can just share there for a second. But we have summaries of each of our 10 chapters. We have an excellent 17-minute video that summarizes the entire report that our Assistant Secretary John McCarthy did for us, which is a very easy way to ease into it. And we have chart packs and contact details and all that sort of stuff. So I'm conscious I only have 5 minutes, and I could probably speak for about 2 hours on it. So I won't go into that. But I was delighted that Marc mentioned the Commission on Taxation and Welfare, because that was an excellent report, and it's the reason my unit was set up, because there was a recommendation there to deliver this sort of long-term economic and fiscal analysis that hadn't been done before, but it had been done in other countries. So we took that recommendation from the Commission and we ran with it. But yeah, I'd highlight Marc's comments that a lot of the rest of that Commission work hasn't really got a lot of traction yet, which is a shame. But the Commission did mention that their work is a form of strategic foresighting, and it should not be a standalone exercise. It said continual reevaluation of trends and developing challenges and opportunities should form part of the future work of government. And I absolutely agree with that. Technically, I wouldn't call Future 40 a strategic foresighting exercise when you look at the actual definition of strategic foresighting, but it does form a really good evidence base for doing strategic foresighting exercises afterwards. And in fact, we've been doing one with the Department of Enterprise and the Department of Further and Higher Ed over the last few months, a small scale one, just to test the methodology. But very briefly, Future 40 provides a central scenario for how things might play out over the next 40 years, and then about over 2,000 illustrative scenarios. And they provide an insight into the long-term trajectory of current policy positions. So the whole thing is based on a no policy change basis. At the start, in formulating the analysis, we did quite an in-depth horizon scanning process, looking at global mega drivers, and lots and lots of countries, including Finland and OECD and organizations like that, had done it. And we settled on 7 areas that we call deep dives that form chapters of Future 40. So we have the 4 Ds is what we call them: demographics, digitalization, decarbonization, and deglobalization. And then layered on top of that, we put in health and housing, because they are quite financially expensive here, and also potentially EU expansion. So those are our 7 chapters really that we base our scenarios on. Each of those chapters has 3 future scenarios, a central one, and then probably what you could classify as a bad one and a good one, and then we multiply that all out to create our 2,000 scenarios. So what it does is the central scenario includes an economic and fiscal position under the current policy arrangements, And then it shows what could be more challenging outcomes should events deviate from current expectations. So what it allows challenges across the policy areas to be compared in terms of their fiscal and economic impact. So we might compare the potential impact of, say, climate change to housing, to health, which is fairly novel. We haven't looked at that before. And it also provides a more complete understanding of when these things will materialize over the next 4 decades. So housing, obviously an issue now, and it could be for the next 10 or 15 years, but over the longer run, then you see things like health and climate change being far more risky from a fiscal perspective. So I just concur with some of the other speakers, moving away from Future 40. I think we have some good governance structures in place and forums which review and guide long-term planning and policy making. As was mentioned earlier, around the expert group and future skills needs. So there's quite a lot in that skills area between the National Skills Council and SOLAS. There's various senior officers groups and the Civil Service Management Board, Project Ireland 2040 Delivery Board. So a lot of these areas are already looking to the future. I would say we probably better set up in the area of capital expenditure rather than current. I think we're quite advanced in terms of planning for capital expenditure over, well, the long term, depending on how you define the long term. There's also sector-specific structures in areas like climate change, housing, and competitiveness. And there's ROCTIS committees, cabinet committees, external independent advisory bodies, and interdepartmental work groups. So I'm not saying everything is perfect, but we're not starting from a blank page, which is great. So we're a little bit familiar with the Finland stuff. We have read about it extensively, and we had Juha Cathasaigh over from Turku University for our annual policy conference last month. He was explaining the system there and it's how the structures of it and also some of its shortcomings. So yeah, they've got a good scenario planning system, good horizon scanning, and it seems to be done at a sectoral level, which is very good, and also very much in depth, which supposedly feeds into the policy making system and brings consistency. And it's also iterative, which is appealing and democratically accountable. So I was doing some more research, and there's an excellent demos study called From Future Awareness to Action, and it's really excellent because it highlights shortcomings, and often we can be shy about them. But I was delighted really that they have shortcomings, because even after 40 years, like, this stuff isn't easy, but it highlights shortcomings between the current system, including a disconnect between all of their frameworks and practical policy making. And an excessive focus on the short term, although they did, interestingly enough, define short term as up to 10 years, which I think here up until recently would have been regarded as medium or long term. But they do say that there is an excessive focus on that. So I think we do have a potential to build up and integrate our foresighting and anticipatory governance in Ireland, using existing structures to begin with, but it requires a lot of planning and buy-in from stakeholders within the system, the political system, and wider system. So Future 40, it's just us dipping our toes in this space. It builds a nice economic and fiscal framework for people to do strategic foresighting and other analysis from. But if it succeed in the long term, it will need to be embedded, or these approaches will need to be embedded in policy systems, budgetary systems, governance systems, and they'll need to be institutionalized across the whole system. But I think we have, it's great that Finland is there and they're so happy to talk to us. So I think there's lots of potential for us to learn from them. That's me, thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And it is very impressive, the work of Future 40. And, the question that comes to mind is that what will it lead to? It's impressive work. There's a 250-page report. And also, it's not the only piece, but it's very impressive work done in Ireland. And what are the next steps? And what would one want to do immediately? Is there something one could immediate steps forward from that work would be an interesting thought to think about a little bit further.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.